Berlin is a fantastic site to study why liberal ideas for organizing societies have come under increasing pressure. We want to find out whether and to what extent contestations of what we call the liberal script are connected around the world.
We want to know how the liberal script has developed, what it actually means, and what it makes difference from other scripts, and what other scripts can essentially contest the liberal script. We want to look at many, many different types of contestations. We are talking about all the right-wing populist authoritarian groups in Western Europe, you know all those. We are also talking about fundamentalist religious movements. Both ISIS and Christian fundamentalists challenge the liberal script. We look at the rising powers, by now Brazil, India, China, Russia, all of those so-called rising power challenge the liberal international order. And we also look at the anti-capitalist social movements which have become transnational, which challenge questions of inequality produced by liberalism. We are interested in all of these different types of contestations, and we want to understand their commonalities and, above all, their specificity.
The script is a script for a play, and they say it in their introduction, with a plot and protagonist and a scenery and all of that. And indeed, this is a play that reaches wide in time and space and tries to tell us that the liberal script has to, in part, lock out European dead white male, who we always associating with liberalism. There's much more to that script and its contestation, and that's what scripts is all about.
Everyone wants to be a democrat. There's no contestation of the term democracy. If you ask Viktor Orban, he wants to be a democrat, but not a liberal democrat. There is a discriminatory power in the term, and it is an encompassing, in that sense, to some extent, specific project. It contains prescriptions, sure, and norms how to organize a society.
We take a global perspective, and we want to look at contestations of the liberal script and historical perspective.
The simple hero-villain story is part of a bigger legend. It says that societies liberalize when security and freedom rules, when people have a reasonable income and a prospect of increasing prosperity, when they have unrestricted access to information, can debate in public and use their intellect. There's a widespread conviction that the strengthening of authoritarian and populist forces, the emergence of illiberal democracies, are occupational hazards along the road that ultimately everyone must take.
The crisis is about the quality of human relationships. We have the rise of xenophobia, and nationalism. I think there's a loneliness of humanity, that humanity actually doesn't provide meaningful emotional connections. There's an emptiness that has come from this cosmopolitanism. There's climate change.
Liberalism is certainly not unguilty regarding the development of the environment.
Maybe there's an underlying structure to a lot of the contestations, which is a dissatisfaction with the, again, to borrow from Polanyi, the powerful disembedding force of late global capitalism, the detachment of economic relations from the social relations and from the relations with the earth that are meaningful to human subjects in many different locations. And that this helps us, I think, to understand why there are so many contestations that have this appeal to an order of meaning beyond this worldly existence.
You cannot have a liberal citizenship policy because the function of these policies is to establish borders, is to establish boundaries that distinguish us from them. And indeed, these presuppositions then have the touch of the illiberal. It is the idea of law enforcement, indeed, law enforcement.
We have very clear evidence by now that the support for authoritarian values and populist right parties and all these kind of things is much higher in these areas. I think we know much less about what the mechanism is that's really driving that.
Liberalism has become a kind of indecent proposal, betrayed by liberals who have entered at the center of power as prime beneficiaries of its extractive logic. All power, even liberal power, corrupts. That's the point.
Can we agree on what liberalism is? The word has been used in different ways, sometimes by the same person in the same talk yesterday. Sometimes liberalism is conflated with democracy, sometimes with capitalism, sometimes with imperialism, American hegemony. Sometimes it seems just a word for modernity, and sometimes it stands for a cluster of moral ideas and duties that are today in crisis.
What is actually the liberalism or the liberal script here? And the way I would see it, and I hope that it's not too much contested, is that there are two elements, namely that persons are autonomous persons, that they have the capacity and therefore the right to think for themselves, and that they have that they have an equal right. And if that is the basic notion, the premise, then you see there is already a tension built in. If each of us has an equal right to autonomy, disagreement will be very likely.
So the core values, I would, as a bit of a provocation to the discussion about liberalism, I would say that they are freedom, but also generosity, and not self-interest.
Liberalism is not about the individual in terms of self. It's about the other individual.
Liberalism, this is provocation, was never about the care of the other. It was always about the care of the self.
The liberal script has changed over time. And in that sense, it is fluid. And yes, slavery, colonialism, racism, and chauvinism were all part of so-called liberal societies. Grave injustices and discriminations are still part of liberal societies. But the decisive point here is, and we should keep this in mind, that anti-slavery movements, anti-colonialists, civil rights movements, all could point to liberal principles in order to strengthen their case. And that's the built-in dynamic of this liberal script.
The underlying root of it is that liberalism is about the redistribution of power. Its origins in the 1500s and the 1600s is about the redistribution of power from the hands of the few into the hands of the many. And I think that this is a concept that's been lost in many conversations today.
Whether or not government taxation is stealing or an act of liberal generosity, it's not one or the other. In order to approach understanding, you cannot exclude either of these meanings. And any kind of an attempt to try and reach the truth by shedding meanings rather than adding multiplex meanings, I think is going to be a very dangerous road in such a project of script of liberalism.
Liberalism, in my view, is not available separately, right? It's part of a container of concepts, of principles, also of constitutionalism. So, to me, the liberal script, if you will, would be that of societies that are governed as liberal democracies, governed under the rule of law with respect to fundamental rights for everyone. So this, I think, is the container that is larger than the liberal script.
Nobody mentioned the term neoliberalism, because when you talk about liberalism only as an idea, rather than as a political, economic, and social processes, they are somehow atemporal, aspatial, ahistorical. And of course, as social scientists, we are all about temporality, spatiality, scalarity in terms of understanding neoliberal globalization as well as liberal ideas.
In fact, I think the notion that neoliberals simply think the markets can do everything is actually wrong and doesn't sustain more than reading about 5 pages of any given neoliberal, because what you realize is actually that neoliberalism is not a theory of markets, in fact. It's a theory of state design and legal design, and it's a question of how to write a constitution, whether it's national, supranational, or even global, that can best protect the rights of individual property holders under conditions of democracy, which they see as tending towards redistribution.
How can we come up with answers and find solutions? How can we even ask the right questions if we don't know what we're talking about when we talk about liberalism? We need some conceptual clarity.
So, first of all, what is a contestation as opposed to a competitor, as opposed to an alternative, as opposed to just critique? And what are the implications of clarifying those concepts?
Is the question for liberalism now that what is the basis for justification rather than already assumed agreement on liberal values?
Contestations in the liberal script are essential to liberalism in itself, right? Contestation is an essential part of liberalism. But where does the balance tilt from contestations in the liberal script to contestations of the liberal script? When do we know that something is really going wrong? When do we know that permanent damage is being done to the script as we know it?
With the end of the Cold War, we have seen an increase of the authority of international institutions and a deepening of their liberal purpose. And I think we need to take this seriously, and this increasing liberal intrusiveness is contested in different ways. Some take issues with how this liberal international authority is exercised, and others completely reject it.
Finding a list of enemies is actually a very unhelpful way of understanding the challenges that are being faced by the liberal script today. I think it reinforces an impression of the world of the recent past, especially just before 2016, as somehow an internally consistent edifice which is now being assailed by barbarians, both foreign, ISIS, and homegrown attack, apparently. Liberalism suffers, I would say, from its own internal contradictions, not simply or even primarily contestations from outside. I would include here inequality, democratic deficits, fatigues, injury, and anxiety of market competition, misguided policies of austerity, blowback from democracy exporting foreign wars, use of peripheral populations as reserve armies of underpaid labor, overruling of popular will through counter-majoritarian fiat, mass incarceration, the narrowing of political voice through the dominance of mainstream political parties, unregulated expansion of tech companies and collusion with security states, tax havenry, and so on.
How resilient is the liberal script? And what defines resilience of the liberal script? So why are some societies, some systems, some states more resilient to resist pressures than others?
In the proposal it says, it's about the justifiability of exclusion of illiberal actors or positions. So it's also a border, a concept of justifying the borders of what a liberal order can tolerate. What are the grounds for such a justification of that order? If these grounds are merely called liberal, we might run into the problem of a petitio principii. Then the liberal order is a self-justifying order. Everything it says to those it calls non-liberals is taken from liberal resources.
So I'd like to throw out there the idea that this is perhaps not a moment to speak about contestations within liberalism. Perhaps we should try to find agreements. Perhaps we should think about a new script for liberalism that can confront the dangers we face today.
When we talk about the liberal script, I mean, what we mean essentially is, I think, a sociological concept. It is not something about the right philosophical interpretation of liberalism judged against any moral standards or something like this. So it's not only a philosophical exercise.
If you go out and just ask about, so what do you think what the liberal script is, this will be problematic, because there will be a lot of data which you cannot compare at all. But defining what the liberal script is equally problematic because, all these concepts are very much Western-centric and, as you both have already pointed out, there are different understandings and we would just reproduce stereotypes, right?
In Turkey, liberalism is kind of a dirty word.
The first one is translation problem. For the same concept, same term, there's always a problem of translating it across space and time, across culture and so on.
And we go around the world asking people, what does the liberal script mean to you? And we will get garbage, and we will get something that doesn't actually have any kind of meaning.
binary. Internal, external contestants, illegitimate, legitimate contestants, area studies, disciplines, universal, local. There are a lot of binaries.
There is these kind of generalizing social sciences who claim that you can actually generalize beyond certain sites and time periods. And there are the area studies that emphasize very much the importance of localizing, of contextualizing our research. And bridging the epistemological and ontological differences between the mainstream social science and the area studies is one of the key, I wouldn't say challenges, but definitely one of the key added values we seek to realize. And to do that, we have developed the concept of double reflexivity.
I think one step is to critically reflect also on the divisions of these disciplinary divides. And one is actually to think about the legacy of both of these disciplines and area studies. Both the social sciences and area studies carry the burden of an imperial legacy of knowledge orders or orders of knowledge that divided the world into different separable bounded entities that were to be compared, classified, and eventually also hierarchized. Double reflexivity then, in addition, might imply that the legacy of this imperial order of knowledge needs to be reflected upon, not only as a reminiscent of the past that is over, but in its duress.
My core point is that from sort of where I stand, I suspect that generalizations are a lot more common than is assumed in this definition of double reflexivity so far. Because I guess that from my perspective, generalizations are also very often practiced by those who are supposedly interested in the particular.
But the question is, where is the edge between generalization and the particular? How do we make a distinction? How do we decide that a generalization is in fact inaccurate or insufficient?
Difference within the seemingly similar and similarity within seeming difference. Why does that matter? Well, because it's the key to expanding the variation, the range of variation in human political social organization. It's not the radically different that is so often important. It is the nearly the same, but still powerfully, saliently different that really matters.
Now, a lot of people have asked us, so you are the cluster to defend or even to rescue the liberal script. No, we are not. But still, there is a certain normativity entailed in our research endeavor, and that refers to the question, or that refers to reflections about what is at stake when the liberal script is contested.
Will new alternative scripts dominate the 21st century, for instance, the Confucian script? Or will we see the current wave in 3 decades or 2 decades from now as one of those that has changed but also strengthened the liberal script? Thank you very much.